Good morning, class. So I'm not turning on the video camera this morning because it's 5:30 in the morning and I just woke up and I was trying to look for the silver linings in all of this, and I guess we don't have to worry about what we look like and what we're wearing. So, take the silver linings as they come. So in chapter 1, we met Pip, and he was scared and he was hanging out in the church cemetery. And in chapter 2, he is running home because that convict demanded that Pip get him some food. So chapter 2, we're going to meet his sister who he lives with and his sister's husband named Joe. After this video, I'm going to go through some of the things that I highlighted and tell you what we're supposed to get from that and answer some common questions that I get during this chapter. All right, so I'm in my book. I'm on page 8. Chapter 2. My sister, Mrs. Joe Gargery, was more than 20 years older than I, and had established a great reputation with herself and the neighbors because she had brought me up by hand, having at that time to find out for myself what the expression meant, and knowing her to have a hard and heavy hand, and to be much in the habit of laying it upon her husband as well as upon me. I suppose that Joe Gargery and I were both brought up by hand. So Mrs. Joe tells everyone that she raised Pip all by herself, meaning she raised him by hand. But she's also physically abusive. She hits Pip a lot, and she also hits her husband. So Pip, who's young, like 6, 7, or 8, assumes that by hand meant through abuse. She was not a good-looking woman, my sister, and I had a general impression that she must have made Joe Gargery marry her by hand. Joe was a fair man with curls of flaxen hair on each side of his smooth face, and with eyes of such a very undecided blue that they seemed to have somehow got mixed up with their own whites. He was a mild, good-natured, sweet-tempered, easy-going, foolish, dear fellow, a sort of Hercules in strength and also in weakness. So I'm going to get my highlighter. I'm going to highlight this characterization of Joe and then Mrs. Joe next. And I'm writing a little note in the margins that Joe is really, really kind. And I'm going to write a little note for Mrs. Joe when I get to her next too. My sister, Mrs. Joe, with black hair and eyes, had such a prevailing redness of skin that I sometimes used to wonder whether it was possible she washed herself with a nutmeg grater instead of soap. She was tall and bony, and almost always wore a coarse apron, fastened over her figure with 2 loops, and having a square, impregnable bib in the front that was stuck full of pins and needles. She made it a powerful merit in herself, and a strong reproach in Joe that she wore this apron so much, though I really see no reason why she should have worn it at all, or why, if she did wear it, she should have not taken it off every day of her life. So she's always wearing this apron, and she blames Pip and Mrs. Joe that she's always doing housework and keeping on this apron. Oh, and I highlighted that part for Mrs. Joe. Joe's forge adjoined our house. Oh, Joe's a blacksmith, and a forge is a blacksmith shop. Joe's forge adjoined our house, which was a wooden house, as many of the dwellings in our country were, most of them at that time. When I ran home from the churchyard, the forge was shut up, and Joe was sitting alone in the kitchen. Joe and I being fellow sufferers, and having confidences as such, Joe imparted a confidence to me the moment I raised the latch of the door and peeped in at him opposite to it, sitting in the chimney door. Mrs. Joe's been out a dozen times looking for you, Pip, and she's out now making it a baker's dozen. Is she? Yes, Joe, said Pip. Yes, Pip, said Joe, and what's worse, she got Tickler with her. At this dismal intelligence, I twisted the only button on my waistcoat round and round, and looked in great depression at the fire. Tickler was a wax-ended piece of cane, worn smooth by collision with my tickled frame. She sot down, said Joe, and she got up, and she made a grab at Tickler, and she rampaged out. That's what she did, said Joe, slowly clearing the fire between the lower bars with the poker, and looking at it. She rampaged out, Pip. Well, how long has she been gone, Joe? I always treated him as a larger species of child and no more than my equal. I'm highlighting that line too, because Pip looks at Joe as this big softy, really childlike, but also treats him as his equal, even though Joe's probably in his early 20s. Well, said Joe, glancing up at the Dutch clock. She's been on the rampage this last spell for about 5 minutes, Pip. She's a-comin'. Get behind the door, old chap, and have the jack-towel betwixt you. I took the advice. My sister, Mrs. Joe, throwing the door wide open and finding an obstruction behind it, immediately divined the cause and applied Tickler to its further investigation. She concluded by throwing me, and I often served as her connubial missile, at Joe, who, glad to get a hold of me on any terms, passed me into the chimney and quietly fenced me up there with his great leg. "Where have you been, you young monkey?" said Mrs. Joe, stamping her foot. "Tell me directly what you've been doing to wear me away with fret and fright and worrit, or I'd have you out of that corner if you was 50 pips and he was 500 gargeries." "I've only been to the churchyard," said I from my stool, crying and rubbing myself. "Churchyard!" repeated my sister. "If it weren't for me, you'd have been to the churchyard long ago and stayed there. Who brought you up by hand?" Mrs. Joe's pointing out that if it wasn't for her stepping in and raising Pip all by herself, he probably would have been buried in the church cemetery alongside all those 5 brothers. "You did," said I. "And why did I do it, I should like to know?" exclaimed my sister. I whimpered, "I don't know." "I don't," said my sister, "and I'd never do it again. I know that. I may truly say I've never had this apron of mine off since born you were. It's bad enough to be a blacksmith's wife and him a gargery without being your mother." My thoughts strayed from that question as I looked disconsolately at the fire. I'm going to highlight that word. Disconsolately means it doesn't make him any happier. He's not consoled. For the fugitive out on that marshes with the iron leg, the mysterious young man, the file, the food, the dreadful pledge I was under to commit a larceny on those sheltering premises, rose before me in the avenging coals. "Ha!" said Mrs. Joe, restoring Tickler to his station. "Churchyard, indeed! You may well say churchyard, you two." One of us, by the by, had not said it at all. "You'll drive me to the churchyard betwixt you one of these days, and oh, a precious pair you'd be without me." And she applied herself to set the tea things, and Joe peeped down at me over his leg, as if he were mentally casting me and himself up, and calculating what kind of pair we practically should make, under the grievous circumstances foreshadowed. And after that he sat feeling his right side flaxen curls and whisker, and following Mrs. Joe about with his blue eyes, and his manner always was at squally times. In that paragraph, grievous, I underline that word, and I'm write down grievous means upsetting. And at the end of the paragraph, squally, squally meaning stormy. So I'm going to highlight and underline and write that means stormy. So think of the word squall. My sister had a trenchant way of cutting our bread and butter for us that never varied. First, with her left hand, she jammed the loaf hard and fast against her bib, where it sometimes got a pin into it, sometimes a needle, which we afterwards got into our mouths. Then she took some butter, not too much, on a knife and spread it on the loaf in an apothecary kind of way, as if she were making a plaster, using both sides of the knife with a slapping dexterity, and trimming and molding the butter off on the crust, and then she gave the knife a final smart wipe on the edge of the plaster, and then she sawed a very thick round off the loaf, which she finally, before separating from the loaf, hewed into 2 halves, of which Joe got one and I the other. On the present occasion, though I was hungry, I dared not eat my slice. I felt that I must have something in reserve for my dreadful acquaintance, and his ally, this still more dreadful young man. I knew Mrs. Joe's housekeeping to be of the strictest kind, and that my larcenous researches might find nothing available in the safe. Therefore, I resolved to put my hunk of bread and butter down the leg of my trousers. Pip keeps saying larceny and larcenous. That's just the technical term that he's about to steal. The effort of resolution necessary to the achievement of this purpose, sticking his slice of bread down the leg of his pants, I found to be quite awful, and it was as if I had to make up my mind to leap from the top of a high house or plunge into a great depth of water, and it was made the more difficult by the unconscious Joe. In our already mentioned Freemasonry as fellow sufferers, and his good-natured companionship with me, it was our evening habit to compare the way we bit through our slices, by silently holding them up to each other's admiration now and then, which stimulated us to new exertions. Tonight, Joe several times invited me, by the display of his fast diminishing slice, to enter upon our usual friendly competition. But he found me each time with my yellow mug of tea on one knee and my untouched bread and butter on the other. At last I desperately considered that the thing I contemplated must be done, and that it had to be best done in the least improbable manner consistent with the circumstances. I took advantage of the moment when Joe had just looked at me and got my bread and butter down my leg. Joe was evidently made uncomfortable by what he supposed to be my loss of appetite, and took a thoughtful bite out of his slice, which he didn't seem to enjoy. He turned it about in his mouth much longer than usual, pondering it over a good deal, and after all gulped it down like a pill. He was about to take another bite, and had just got his head on one side for a good purchase on it, when his eye fell on me, and he saw that my bread and butter was gone. The wonder and consternation with which Joe stopped on the threshold of his bite and stared at me were too evidently to escape my sister's observation. So they've each got these big halves of bread. So imagine yourself with like a Subway size half of a loaf of bread. And Joe thinks that Pip actually swallowed his all in one bite. "What's the matter now?" my sister smartly, as she put down her cup. "I say, muttered Joe, shaking his head at me in a very serious remonstrance. "Pip, old chap, you'll do yourself a mischief. It'll stick somewhere. You can't have chewed it, Pip." "What's the matter now?" repeated my sister, more sharply than before. "Oh, if you can cough any trifle on it up, Pip, I'd recommend you do it," said Joe, all aghast. "Manners is manners, but still, your health's your health." Well, by this time my sister was quite desperate, so she pounced on Joe, and taking him by the two whiskers, knocked his head for a little while against the wall behind him, and while I sat in the corner, looking guiltily on. "Now perhaps you'll mention what's the matter," said my sister, out of breath. "You staring great-stuck pig." Joe looked at her in a helpless way, then took a helpless bite, and looked at me again. Pip," said Joe solemnly. I'm going to underline that word, means calmly and quietly. With his last bite in his cheek, and speaking in a confidential voice, as if we were two quite alone, "you and me is always friends, and I'd be the last to tell upon you any time, but such a—" He moved his chair and looked about the floor between us, then at me again. "Such a most uncommon bolt as that." If you look down the bottom of the page, a bolt is to swallow a big bite without chewing. "Been bolting his food, has he?" cried my sister. Old chap," said Joe, looking at me and not at Mrs. Joe, with his bite still in his cheek, "I bolted myself when I was your age, frequent, and as a boy I've been among as many bolters, but I never seen your bolting equal yet, Pip, and it's a mercy you ain't bolted dead." My sister made a dive at me and fished me up by the hair, saying nothing more than the awful words, "You come along and be dosed." Some medical beast had revived tar water in those days. Down at the bottom of your page, tar water is what they keep in their medicine cabinet. It is literally tar that has been infused in water. This black murky water, because tar. Some medical beast had revived tar water in those days as a fine medicine, and Mrs. Joe always kept a supply of it in the cupboard, having a belief in its virtues correspondent to its nastiness. At the best of times, so much of the elixir was administered to me as a choice restorative that I was conscious of going about smelling like a new fence. On this particular evening, the urgency of my case demanded a pint of this mixture, which was poured down my throat for my greater comfort, while Mrs. Joe held my head under her arm as a boot would be held in a boot jack. Joe got off with half a pint, but he was made to swallow that, much to his disturbance as he sat slowly munching and meditating before the fire, because he had had a turn. Judging from myself, I should say he certainly had a turn afterwards if he'd had none before. Conscience is a dreadful thing when it accuses man or boy, but when, in the case of a boy, that secret burden cooperates with another secret burden down the leg of his trousers, it is, as I can testify, a great punishment. The guilty knowledge that I was going to rob Mrs. Joe. I never thought I was going to rob Joe, for I never thought of any of the housekeeping property as his. United to the necessity of always keeping one hand on my bread and butter as I sat, or when I was ordered about the kitchen on any small errand, almost drove me out of my mind. Then, as the marsh winds made the fire glow and flare, I thought I heard the voice outside of the man with the iron on his leg, who had sworn me to secrecy, declaring that he couldn't and wouldn't starve until tomorrow and must be fed now. At other times I thought, what if the young man who was with so much difficulty restrained from imbruing his hands in me should yield to a constitutional impatience, or should mistake the time, and should think himself accredited to my heart and liver tonight instead of tomorrow? If ever anybody's hair stood on end with terror, mine must have done so then, but perhaps nobody's ever did. I highlighted the first couple sentences of that paragraph, and I wrote a note that Pip seems to be consumed by his guilt. Moving on. It was Christmas Eve. I highlighted that too. And I had to stir the pudding for the next day with a copper stick from 7 to 8 by the Dutch clock. I tried it with the load upon my leg, and that made me think afresh of the man with the load on his leg, and I found the tendency of exercise to bring the bread and butter out of my ankle quite unmanageable. Happily, I slipped away and deposited the part of my conscience in the garret bedroom. In that paragraph, I'm going to highlight the section that says that bread and butter, the load on Pip's leg, made me think afresh of the man with the load on his leg, because that Pip has bread and butter down his pants, and that man has a great iron in his leg. So they're both being linked together by this. And then at the end of the paragraph, I highlighted the word garret. Garret means tower. So up in the attic is his bedroom. "Hark," said I, when I had done my stirring and was taking a final warm in the chimney corner before being sent up to bed. "Was that the great guns, Joe?" "Ah," said Joe, "there's another convict off." What does that mean, Joe?" said I. Mrs. Joe, who always took explanations upon herself, said snappishly, "Escaped! Escaped!" administering the definition like tar water. While Mrs. Joe sat with her head bending over her needlework, I put my mouth into forms of saying to Joe, "What's a convict?" And Joe put his mouth into the forms of returning such a highly elaborate answer that I could make out nothing of it but the single word, Pip. "There was another convict off last night," said Joe aloud, "after sunset gun, and they fired warning of him, and now it appears they're firing warning of another." "Who's firing?" said I. "Drat that boy!" interposed my sister, frowning at me over her work. "What a questioner he is! Ask no questions, and you'll be told no lies." It was not very polite to herself, I thought, to imply that I should be told lies by her, even if I did ask questions. But she never was polite unless there was company. At this point, Joe greatly augmented. I'm going to highlight the word augmented. It means added to. At this point, Joe greatly augmented my curiosity by taking the utmost pains to open his mouth very wide and to put it into the form of a word that looked to me like sulks. Therefore, I naturally pointed to Mrs. Joe and put my mouth into the form of saying, "Her?" But Joe wouldn't hear that. and at all, and again opened his mouth very wide, and she shook the form of a most emphatic word out of it. Emphatic, I'm going to highlight it and write down the word emphasized. But I could make nothing of the word. Mrs. Joe, said I, as a last resource, I should like to know, if you wouldn't much mind, where the firing comes from. Lord bless the boy, exclaimed my sister. She didn't quite mean that, but the contrary. From the hulks. Oh, said I, looking at Joe. Hulks. Joe gave a reproachful cough, as much to say, well, I told you so. And please, what's hulks? Said I. That's the way with this boy, exclaimed my sister, pointing me out with the needle and thread and shaking her head at me. Answer him one question, he'll ask you a dozen directly. Hulks are prison ships right across the marshes. We always use that name for the marshes in our country. I wonder who's put into prison ships and why they're put there, said I, in a general way and with quiet desperation. It was too much for Mrs. Joe, who immediately rose. I tell you what, young fellow, she said, I didn't bring you up by hand to badger people's lives out, and it would be to blame to me and not praise if I had. People are put in the hulks because they murder, and because they rob and forge and do all sorts of bad, and they always begin by asking questions. Now, you get along to bed. I was never allowed a candle to light me to bed, and as I went upstairs in the dark with my head tingling from Mrs. Joe's thimble having played the tambourine upon it to accompany her last words, I felt fearfully sensible of the great convenience that the hulks were handy for me, and I was clearly on my way there. I'd begun by asking questions, and I was going to rob Mrs. Joe. Since that time, which is far enough away now, I'm going to highlight that phrase, which is far enough away now. We get some clues that tell us he's narrating this from the future. I've often thought that few people know what secrecy there is in the young, under terror, no matter how reasonable the terror, so that it be terror. If I was in mortal terror of the young man who wanted my heart and liver, I was in mortal terror of my interlocutor with the iron leg. I was in mortal terror of myself, from whom an awful promise had been extracted, and I had no hope of deliverance through my all-powerful sister, who repulsed me at every turn, and I'm afraid to think of what I might have done on requirement, in the secrecy of my terror. If I slept at all that night, it was only to imagine myself drifting down the river on a strong spring tide to the hulks, a ghostly pirate calling out to me through a speaking trumpet as I passed the gibbet station, that I had better come ashore and be hanged there at once, and not put it off. I was afraid to sleep, even if I had been inclined, for I knew that at the first faint dawn of morning I must rob the pantry. There was no doing it in the night, for there was no getting a light by easy friction then. To have got one, I must have struck it out of flint and steel, and then made a noise like the very pirate himself rattling his chains. As soon as the great black velvet pall outside my little window was shot with gray, I highlighted that phrase, the great black velvet pall. It's a metaphor he's using to refer to the dark night outside. Was shot with gray, I got up and went downstairs, every board upon the way and every crack in every board calling after me, "Stop, thief, and get up, Mrs. Joe." In the pantry, which was far more abundantly supplied than usual, owing to the season, it's Christmas, I was very much alarmed by a hare hanging up by the heels, who I rather thought I caught when my back was half turned, winking. I had no time for verification, no time for selection, no time for anything, for I had no time to spare. I stole some bread, some rind of cheese, about half a jar of mincemeat, which I tied up in my pocket handkerchief with my last night's slice, some brandy from a stone bottle, which I decanted into a glass bottle and had secretly used for making that intoxicating fluid, Spanish licorice water, up in my room, diluting the stone bottle from a jug in the kitchen cupboard, a meat bone with very little on it, and a beautiful round, compact pork pie. I was nearly going away without the pie, but I was tempted to mount upon a shelf to look what it was that was put away so carefully in a covered earthenware dish in the corner. And I found it was the pie, and I took it in the hope that it was not intended for early use and would not be missed for some time. There was a door in the kitchen communicating with the forge, and I unlocked and unbolted that door, and I got a file from among Joe's tools. Then I put the fastenings as I had found them, opened the door at which I had entered when I ran home last night, shut it, and ran from the misty marshes. I'm going to take a pause for just a second here. Um, all right, we're back. I just had to move some slides around. So what did I highlight in my book? On the first page of that chapter, I mentioned the characterization of Mrs. Joe and Mr. Joe, that it's Christmas, some characterization. I'm going to go through some of those items right now. So some characterization that we found out about Mrs. Joe, and I'm going to add her to my characters chart so I can keep everyone straight later on. Mrs. Joe is all of these qualities. Abusive, mean. We found out that she's 20 years older than Pip. So this is a little rough. If Pip's 6 or 7 or 8, then she's 26 or 27. She's really hardworking. She's self-sacrificing. She takes her stress out on Joe and Pip. Physically, she's always yelling at them and sounds like hitting them as well. Joe Gargery, her husband, is kind and tender. He's a blacksmith. That word we kept saying, he works in his forge. The blacksmith shop is right attached to their house. He's definitely a gentle giant. They said he's big. He's like Hercules in strength, but also he's really kind and childlike. And then I highlighted the parts in the book where Pip says he refers to him as his equal and a fellow sufferer under Mrs. Joe. So some questions I frequently get when I read that chapter in class is, why would a nice guy like Joe marry Mrs. Joe? And why does Pip call her Mrs. Joe? Pip calls her Mrs. Joe, first of all, because that is the proper way to refer to a married woman back then, even though it is his sister. He doesn't have a very sisterly relationship with her, and she is basically his parent. But why would Mrs. Joe marry her? So back in Victorian times, and for a lot of times in our world, it's a history for that matter, people aren't marrying for romantic love. They're marrying out of economic necessity. And Pip is from a super small town. And if you think about it, there's not many people who are around the same age in order to marry. And Mrs. Joe here's Mrs. Joe, or before she got married, here's this woman who was raising this young child all by herself, and not married. And here's another person, Joe, a blacksmith, and he runs this blacksmith shop, and he needs a domestic partner at home. Literally, he needs someone at home who can do the housework side of things while he does the money earning. So he's working in the forge all day, and running a household back then was a full-time job. So Mrs. Joe needs someone to earn money. So they marry out of economic necessity. We look at Mrs. Joe and the housekeeping. If you think of making dinner back then and how on earth you would just get your groceries, make your bread by hand, make it from scratch. Your tonight's meal would probably be months in the making and figuring out and planning, and then she's also got responsibilities, like washing all the clothes is going to take hours. Making sure that the house is in order, that's a full-time job. So they probably married, like a lot of people did, because the woman needed someone to earn the money, and the man needed someone to take care of him, and all of those housekeeping jobs. We talked about what is bolting your food while eating the chapter. It's swallowing whole. You might have heard the outdated rule, maybe from grandparents, that you're supposed to chew something 30 times before you swallow, that you know is not true anymore or necessary. But this is Victorian era, and they believe very much in rules. And this is the time when they said, you've got to chew something 30 times before you swallow it. So if Pip is swallowing, they believe, this, chunk of bread, this half loaf of bread whole, that's it's punishable by tar water. Why does Joe talk like that is a common question I get. We can tell from Joe's speech that he's a little bit slow, he's a little bit uneducated, but he also he speaks with an accent because we are talking about an area outside of about an hour or two outside of London. So we're going to have a regional dialect here. And we also notice that Joe talks quietly to Pip and tries not to be overheard by Mrs. Joe because he is, again, trying to not get Pip in trouble. Also, again, that Hulk's on the River, same slide from before, that big prison ship that's filled with convicts. So some analysis from this chapter. Again, I did add to my character list, but some archetypes that we're seeing right now, I highlighted that it's Christmas. Why would Christmas be thematically important? We're beginning our book in a season that implies renewal and promise for a new time. Also, it's winter, so people are going to be forced together by weather. And did you notice how Pip seems consumed by a sense of guilt? I highlighted some of that in the top of page 13, and I made a note in my book at the top of page 13 that this guilt seems to impact his actions. For being such a young kid, again, 6 or 7 or 8 years old, he seems to have an inordinate amount of guilt. And it is, where did he get that sense of guilt from such a young age? And then also with that guilt, and he doesn't even know what these hulks are. He's asking for a clear explanation, but Mrs. Joe yells at him and says, "Oh, everyone who's bad goes to the hulks, and it probably started when they were young kids by asking annoying questions." So he doesn't realize that she's just being mean, and he internalizes that. And as he goes to bed that night, he does have a fear that he must be intended straight for a life of being a criminal. And it's already stealing from his house. So we also see that Pip has a rampant imagination. Also, we get a foil pair of Joe and Mrs. Joe. I'm writing that in my book on page 8. They even bring the characterization paragraphs back to back. So they are both Pip's, air quotes, parents. But we have one who's the gentle giant, who is kind and friendly, and the other one who is smaller in stature but makes up for it with her loud yelling and her abusive personality. So we get a foil pair there. Before you do put your book down, go ahead and turn back to the beginning of the chapter or at the end of the chapter, wherever you have some space. Give yourself a second to write a quick sentence of a one sentence chapter summary in your book. You can jot down your new characters and your people and places chart. If you and your friend want to have a common people and places chart and you're both doing the work on that document, that is just fine with me. We are going to have a lot of characters that'll fade in and out to try and keep them all straight. Also, at the end, when we do our project and you want to quickly be able to find quotes and where characterization was, this will help you out. So we can find that on Google Classroom. All right. Well, thank you for joining me for chapter 2. You can join in with me for another installment of chapter 3 in a little bit whenever you're ready. You're probably flipping through your book right now, and chapter 3 is much shorter than chapter 2. So I'll see you then. Have a good day.